r/NoSleep. Posted by u/withywoodwitch. I work in a nursing home and something strange is happening to the residents. Part 2. I went to bed feeling much more secure and calm. The belief that Bert had passed had evidently colored my feelings towards him, and that wasn't fair. I had a day off the following day, and when I returned to work I would treat him as I'd always done, without prejudice. Everything was fine. I had a horrible dream that night. I dreamt I had been out drinking and caught the wrong bus, and instead of going home I found myself at work in the early hours of the morning, my makeup smudged and head spinning. It seemed logical in the dream that, rather than calling an Uber, I go into work and ask if I could stay there. The night staff let me in. There was a bed I could sleep in, they said, but it was tricky and I had to promise to keep quiet. I didn't care. I was tired and drunk. They took me to a room, not Bert's, but a different one that shouldn't have been there, in a part of the building that didn't exist. Elsie died today, they told me. You can have her bed. We didn't have anyone in our building called Elsie, but I didn't question it. Nor did I question the fact that Elsie's body hadn't been removed. She was a shape under a sheet, face and body covered, but I was too tired to point it out. I lay across the foot of her bed like a dog and tried to sleep. I couldn't sleep very well, though. Elsie's body kept twitching and jerking, feet drumming an irregular rhythm against me. I wanted to get up and report to the night staff that they were mistaken, that Elsie wasn't dead, but at the same time I knew she was, and I would just have to tolerate it if I wanted a place to stay. Right before I woke up, the shape under the sheet started to rise, as if this unknown Elsie were sitting up, and I watched with absent-minded horror, knowing I should be scared of what was happening but ultimately more scared of making a fuss and appearing ungrateful. I woke up with a jolt. My bedroom was still dark, and I found myself groping over the covers to make sure I was in my own bed and not one that was already occupied by a corpse. My bed was empty but for me, and although I knew it was just a dream I had to put my bedside light on and read for a while before I could get back to sleep. I went back to work exhausted. I hadn't slept well since I'd seen Bert die. He hadn't visited any of my dreams, but I'd witnessed plenty of disturbing things nonetheless when I should have been at rest. I hoped once I'd spoken to him and seen him being normal I'd be able to get all this nonsense out of my system. Despite my determination to face my fears, I was nervous when I sat down in the office for handover. The night nurse filled us all in on what had happened the previous night before Helen, the senior sister on that morning's shift, started assigning us to residents. Mabel was constipated. Ruby was confused. Dennis was looking peaky. The usual stuff. Bert, however. He had been wandering during the night, surprising the night staff with his sudden mobility. Although they'd urged him to go to bed, he had refused, saying he would sleep when he was dead. This was out of character for Bert. He loved to sleep and often went to bed early. He also smelled bad, apparently, and I groaned inwardly at that. Most likely he would need a bath, and I had no doubt I would be assigned to do it. It was no secret Bert had always been a favorite of mine. Sure enough, Bert was among my short list of charges that morning, and he was to be given a bath. I didn't want to do it. For a moment I considered faking illness and using one of my precious sick days to get out of what I had to do, but I knew it would be ultimately pointless. I would have to come back at some point, and the sooner I met up with Bert and reminded myself I was being silly, the sooner I would be able to get on as normal. Despite my resolve, I dealt with my other assigned residents first. Doris and Nellie were semi-independent and didn't need much help washing and dressing, so as soon as I had escorted them to the dining room I was free to tackle Bert. He was sitting in his room, his chair angled towards the door rather than the window. He had always liked to watch the birds outside. There was a bird bath and feeding table where he could see it, but now it seemed he would rather watch the people inside. Immediately, I could see what they had been talking about. The smell was heavy and unpleasant. Sweet and yeasty, like moldy bread. He didn't smile when he saw me. A corner of his mouth twitched, like his muscle memory was attempting to smile, but that was all. I smiled anyway, putting on my sunniest expression, trying to squash down the feeling of repulsion that had risen again. "Morning, Bert. I hear you've been up and about. You're going to wear yourself out." He smiled then, something that more resembled a leer. "Can't stop me, can they?" he croaked. His voice sounded earthy and damp, somehow, something that had been buried and left to rot. I suppressed a shudder and gave myself a mental shake instead. Stupid idea. He was just an old man getting over a serious illness. "I've been told you need a bath, Bert," I continued. "You fancy it?" I was hoping he'd say no, leaving me guiltless, but he nodded, that leery grin widening. His lips were dry, and the thin skin on them cracked when they stretched. I had always helped Bert undress when he needed it, but it had been different then. He had participated, shrugging his shoulders from his shirt, leaning to give me access. And he had kept up a stream of chatter that made what could have been an awkward, intimate task far more comfortable. Not now, though. This new Bert sat like a lump of meat, watching me unbutton his shirt and unzip his fly with disquieting concentration. His breath touched my face on more than one occasion, when I had to get close. It might have been my overactive imagination, but it felt cold rather than warm. The smell wasn't my imagination though, a stale, meaty reek that made me want to gag. I held my own breath whenever I could. There was no talking, either. Normally when with an unresponsive resident I would have filled the silence with chatter about the weather and reports on the progress of the bath, but today I let the dripping of the tap and the splashing of the water do the job instead. That, and the groan and whistle of the air entering and exiting his mouth. He breathed hard and slow, as if he were constantly reminding himself to do it. It wasn't until I was drying him off that he finally spoke. "Where were you?" he asked. "Had my day off, Bert," I told him, toweling the sparse fluff of his hair. "Can't work 7 days a week, you know. I do need a rest." He looked at me, sunken eyes considering my reply. "I didn't mean yesterday," he said finally. "I meant the other time. When I woke up." I had to suppress a shudder. "Woke up? Why did you leave me?" he persisted. There was an unpleasant little gleam in his eye I didn't like a bit. I felt like it was a trick question. "Went off and left a dying man," he said. "Not like you, Bren. Must have been a reason." "What was that?" He was goading me. He knew very well. He just wanted me to say it out loud. But I wasn't about to make it easy. Whatever he was now, he wasn't Bert as far as I was concerned. The mean little smirk on his face confirmed that for me. I looked him in the eye. Dead in the eye, as it were. I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. "Went to the toilet, Bert," I said. "Can't ignore nature when it calls." He laughed then, coughing the sound out in a series of strangled jerks, and I found myself wishing he'd choke on his amusement. I forced a false smile onto my own face. "Time for breakfast," I said. "You want to walk, or shall I get you a chair?" He waved his hand then, brushing my question away with disgust plain on his face. "I'll walk," he said. "Fuck your chair." It might seem like a small detail, but it's significant. Bert never used foul language. He was always of the opinion that such words were below him. I don't disapprove of the word fuck. Far from it. I use it all the time. But never around the residents. And I rarely heard it from one of them. So to hear Bert say it after years of caring for him was jarring. There had been another resident, Jack, who had suffered a stroke whilst in our care. He'd been very soft-spoken and polite before the stroke, but afterwards we found out that not only had it made his whole right side weak and useless, but had robbed him of every single other word in his vocabulary that wasn't offensive. Saying good morning to Jack would result in a reply of fuck off, delivered in a tone that made it clear he was wishing you a good morning right back. So maybe Bert had had a stroke. It was something I could have believed, if it weren't for the fact that he was more mobile than he had ever been since I'd known him, and that did not make sense at all. There were no excuses. Something strange had happened with Bert and it wasn't my imagination. The dining area of the common room was a potential war zone when it came to seating. A lot of the residents had become accustomed to the seating arrangements and would not allow any meddling, but Bert didn't care about that. I tried to steer him towards an almost empty table near a window, but he ignored my cajoling and sat himself near the kitchen. There was an unspoken hierarchy amongst the residents, and the table usually occupied by Ruby and Dan and Rose was what would probably be considered the top table, so when Bert pulled up an extra chair to sit with them they regarded him with polite disbelief. He bared his teeth at them in what could have been a smile, and refused offers of porridge and cereal. He only wanted meat. We served him sausages and bacon, and he pushed his fork aside to attack his meal with his hands. Ruby turned her head away with genteel distaste, and he laughed as he gobbled his breakfast, licking his fingers and showering gobs of food onto the tablecloth. Rose got up and left. She was pretty mobile, and she reached a pretty brisk speed as she shuffled away with her walking frame, the set of her shoulders making her disapproval very clear. Ruby followed close behind, leaning on her stick and muttering something about manners. Only Anne remained, watching her new breakfast companion with horrified fascination, and recoiling when he gave a large, liquid belch. Bert grinned at her. There were scraps of bacon between his teeth and grease on his chin. "Your friends don't have the stomach for me," he said in his new, Gargling voice, picking at his teeth with a thumbnail. Pity. We could have had some fun. He dropped another slow-motion wink then, and leaned across the table. He said something else to Anne then, something which, out of respect to her, I won't repeat, but it was delivered in an exaggerated stage whisper that could be heard all over the dining room, even above the subdued chatter and clinking of cutlery. Anne went pale, clutching at the neck of her blouse, and the room fell into shocked silence. I knew I should say something. What Bert had suggested to Anne was unacceptable, but I was lost for words. There weren't many male residents at the home, and the only other one who was at breakfast that day was Dennis. I heard his chair scrape as he stood, and turned round. Dennis was shaking with rage, a butter knife in his hand. "Make him apologize," he said, waving the blunt knife in Bert's direction. "You don't say things like that to a lady." Bert laughed, slapping the table as though it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard, but his face didn't laugh even though his mouth did. His eyes were fixed on Dennis and I didn't like the way he was staring at all. I got my feet to move, and stood in between them, cutting off their line of vision. Anne was sobbing quietly as another carer escorted her from the room. Bert stopped laughing, the sound cutting off as though a door to a soundproof room had slammed shut, and he glared at me. "You've gone too far, Bert," I said. His lip curled in a sneer, but he didn't reply. Just heaved himself to his feet and stalked away stiffly. I made sure everyone else was settled, and that the other carers had everything under control, then I went to find the senior sister. She was paid more than me. She could deal with this.